Isn't it a great day to be a Christian? Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. It's been almost a month ago since we started talking about Joseph. We've had several things happen since then, had a singing, and we were out of town, but we'll go back and talk some more about Joseph. Last time we said that Joseph was Jacob's favorite child, and sometimes Joseph didn't do so great when he was dealing with temptation. Appreciate Brother Creighton for leading Yield Not to Temptation, because that's really the main point about what this sermon's about, is how Joseph dealt with temptation. We looked at how he became a slave in Egypt, how he became a slave in the house of Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's guards. And tonight we're going to look at his journey from the prison into the palace. But before we do that, let's go back to Genesis 39 and review just a little bit, beginning in verse 1. It says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he had made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored." Now apparently Joseph has done some growing up since the time he was back at Jacob's house, since he was being kind of a brat, rubbing it in his brother's face about how they were all going to bow down and do obeisance to him. And he's doing well, and God's blessing him because he's doing well. And he's still a slave, but all things considered, he's doing pretty well. And then temptation strikes Joseph again. Verse 7 says, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me." Have you ever wondered what was going through Joseph's mind when this happened? He could have been tempted. He could have wanted to do that. Remember, Joseph had been pretty arrogant back at home. Maybe this was his chance. "Oh, you're going to make me a slave? I'll show you something." He could have gotten back at Potiphar through his wife. But this time, Joseph didn't give in to any temptations. This time, he remembered God. Verse 8 says, "But he refused and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee. Because thou art his wife, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" This time, Joseph's not thinking about Joseph. This time, Joseph is thinking about what God would want him to do. Brothers and sisters, that's the same thing that we need to do when we face temptation. What would God want me to do? There's a lot more to this story, but I want us to take a few moments right now and see how Joseph dealt with this temptation, and see if there's some things in his life that we can use in our life. There are lots of folks that don't do too well when they face temptation. So we're going to look at 5 things that Joseph did that we might want to consider. And number 1, he accepted responsibility for his action. When Mrs. Potiphar asked him to go to bed with her, he asked, "How can I do this?" He said, "That's not right. I shouldn't do it." He could have said, "Well, now none of this is my fault." He said, "I was taken a slave. I've had a really bad life. I've had a bad childhood. I'm not responsible for my actions because I suffer persecution. I'm a victim of my circumstances. So it's okay if I do this." He didn't say that. A lot of people today would see that this is an older woman preying on this teenager. They'd say she was taking advantage of him. He could say, "Yes, she just took advantage of me. There was nothing I could do." Joseph didn't make any excuses for doing something that he knew he wasn't supposed to do. He could have said, "This is the boss's wife. I've got to do what she says." He said, "How can I do this?" Because he knew that it was wrong. It may have been what he wanted to do, but he knew it wasn't what he was supposed to do. Second thing, he recognized that sin is sin. Joseph said, how can I then do this great wickedness? He knew that what she was asking him to do was wrong. Today in our culture, sin is minimalized. It's just something that happens. It's just kind of like a rite of passage. We see people talking about sowing their wild oats and, oh, well, he just made a mistake. He messed up. Everybody else is doing it. There are euphemisms for sin today. We call the sin of homosexuality being gay. People call the sin of murdering innocent unborn children as women's reproductive health care. Joseph realized that sin was sin. He didn't say, oh, I shouldn't do that. That would be a mistake. He said it would be a great wickedness. It wouldn't be an accident. It would be a willful act. And Joseph said, I can't do that. Number 3, he realized that sin is committed against God. When he was asked to go to bed with his master's wife, he didn't say, I can't sin against my master, even though it would have been a sin against his master. He would have been betraying the person that had put him in charge of the house. Joseph said, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Sin is a violation of God's will. And Joseph was being loyal to his earthly master, but the main thing Joseph was concerned about this time was what God would be pleased with him doing. Joseph sought to please God. Number 4, when he faced this temptation, Joseph avoided her. You go back and read verse 10, it says, and it came to pass as she spake to Joseph day by day. This was an ongoing thing. It said that he hearkened not to her, to lie by her, or to be with her. In other words, Joseph just quit listening to her. She kept on and on and on, and Joseph just ignored her. He didn't want to be around her. He refused to be with her. How many temptations could we avoid if we just refuse to be around them? I mean, what is it that tempts you? Why do you stay close to it? Why do you let that in your life? Why don't you avoid it? Why don't you ignore it? Why don't you stay away from it? And number 5, when all else failed, Joseph just ran. He got away. When Joseph couldn't avoid the woman, when he was alone with her in her house, and he was faced with having to act, he just left her holding on to his coat, and he took off. And if that's the only way you can escape temptation, then you need to run. Now, let's go back to our story. The first time Joseph gave in to his temptation to be arrogant, to be rude to his brothers, and they hated him as a result of it. Because of it, they threw him in a pit. They sold him into slavery. Because of that, he was in Egypt. This time, Joseph is tempted again, and this time he resists the temptation, and he's punished anyway. When Joseph wouldn't sin with Potiphar's wife, she lied about him, said that he tried to attack her. Apparently, he wouldn't do what she wanted. She'd just get rid of him. So Potiphar had him thrown into prison. Genesis 39:20 says, and Joseph's master took him, put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Now, when we left off last month, Joseph was in charge of the prison. And 2 of the king's most important servants, the baker and the butler, or the cupbearer, were put into his care. And we remember they had a dream, and the butler dreamed, and Joseph asked Joseph what happened. Joseph told him that, well, it was going to be 3 days, and he was going to be put back in charge of the king's cup. He was going to be put back in charge of the cup, as the cupbearer, the butler. He'd get his job back. The baker, on the other hand, was told in 3 days he'd be executed, and both of those things happened. Genesis 40, beginning with verse 14, when Joseph told the cupbearer about his dream, that he was going to be taken out of prison, he was going to put back into Pharaoh's court, he made a request of it. Genesis 40:14 says, but think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. Joseph said, okay, here's your dream now. This is going to happen. When it does, when you go back to Pharaoh's court, when you're back in your old job, do me a favor, tell Pharaoh. Tell him about me. Tell him that I'm here, that I shouldn't be here, and I need to be set free. And I wonder how much time passed before Joseph realized what happened in verse 23. Verse 23 said, "Yet did not the chief butler remember him." And we all know that that's not the end of the story, but Joseph didn't. What's going to keep him going in the dungeon? I mean, Joseph was 17 when his brothers sold him into bondage. We don't know how long he served Potiphar, and we don't know exactly how long he was in prison, but we know that this time in our story, it's been 13 years, because Genesis 41:46 says that he was 30 when the next episode in this life takes place. So imagine 13 years of being away from home, 13 years of being a slave, of being in prison for something that you didn't do. Meanwhile, God is still working in Joseph's life. In chapter 41, Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh's dream, he's standing by a river, and these seven good-looking cows come up out of the river. And they're standing there grazing, and then these 7 scraggly-looking cows come up out of the river, and they eat the first 7 cows. And Pharaoh woke up. I don't know about you, but I think if I dreamed about meat-eating cows, I'd wake up too. That sounds like a nightmare. These cows that come up and they start eating on these other cows. Pharaoh woke up, but he went back to sleep, and this time he dreamed about 7 healthy heads of grain that were growing in the field. And then these 7 puny heads of grain came along, and they ate the first 7. This time Pharaoh woke up and he stayed awake, and he was puzzled about what his dream meant. And so he called all of his wise men and his counselors and his magicians and asked them to interpret the dream, but they couldn't do it. And the chief cupbearer was in the court, and he realized what was going on. And finally, after 2 years, he remembered Joseph. Now look at verse 9. I like the way it's worded. It says, Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. In other words, he said, I have messed up. I was supposed to tell you something, and I forgot. Something's going on. I should have told you about it. It slipped my mind. And so then he relays the story about how Joseph interpreted his dream while he was in prison. And he told him he could do the same thing for him. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph. And verse 15, And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And now Joseph's in the driver's seat. After 13 long years of struggling, Pharaoh has come to him asking him for a favor. He needs something. And the Bible doesn't say it, but if you think about it, Joseph's facing another temptation. How would you have reacted in this situation? I might have said, well, yes, sir, I can tell you what your dream meant if you'll keep me out of prison and send me back home. I'll make a deal with you. I might be wondering, I'll tell you what your dream means. How much would it be worth? I mean, you're the king. You can pay me anything that you've got. How did Joseph respond? Verse 16 says, And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. I saw somebody wearing a t-shirt the other day. It said, I can't do it, but I know a guy. All right? That's what Joseph was saying. He said, I can't interpret your dream, but I know a God that can. I know somebody that can do this. Joseph not only didn't ask something for himself, Joseph didn't even take credit for interpreting the dream. He wanted to give all the honor to God. Here's an opportunity for him to be really special. He liked being special 13 years ago. Now he's a lot more humble. So he interprets Pharaoh's dream. He tells him there are going to be 7 years of plenty in the land. And then there are going to be 7 years of famine. And then in order to prepare, that the king needs to put somebody in charge to save up during the 7 plentiful years of harvest, gather 20% of the crops each year, lay those aside so that they'll be prepared for the famine. Now go down to verse 37. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. Joseph had arrived. After 13 years of struggling, Joseph was finally being rewarded. Keep reading in verse 41. It says, And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. We're talking tonight about temptations. And surely in those 13 years, Joseph had been tempted to give up. Joseph had probably been tempted to just forget about home, forget about everything. But Joseph stayed loyal to God. And now he's being rewarded. Now he's literally in charge of all of Egypt. Joseph had some more temptations. What would I have done if I had been in this place? My first thought would be, well, bring me Mrs. Potiphar. I want her to talk to her husband and tell him what really went on back at that house that ended up with me being thrown into prison. I want her to face justice. He could have called for the cupbearer and say, bring me the chief cupbearer. Let's see how he likes being in jail for 2 years. Let's see if he likes being put somewhere. He could have got me out of there a long time ago if he'd have done what I asked him. He could have even said, how about we get some Egyptian troops and we send them back to Canaan? I got these brothers that need to be thrown in a pit. Or these brothers that need to become slaves. Joseph could have done anything to anybody. I might have been tempted to do that. But Joseph didn't do that. He resisted temptation. Instead of serving himself, he went to work fulfilling what God had told him needed to be done. And after 7 years, it happened just like God said it would. Joseph took the crops he laid by in store. They put all the things in these great storage places. And then in verse 56, it says, And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. But Egypt wasn't the only place that was suffering. Verse 57 says, And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands, and that included back in Joseph's homeland. Look at chapter 42, verse 1. It says, Now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, Why do you look one upon another? And he said, Behold, I've heard there's corn in Egypt. Get you down thither, and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. Basically, Jacob said, why y'all just standing here looking at each other? They got corn in Egypt. Go get some before we starve to death. So he sent them down there. Verse 5 says, And the sons of Israel came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Verse 6, it says, And Joseph was the governor over the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. Now look closely at this next statement. It says, And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. Does that remind you of anything? Remember back at the beginning of our story a month ago, Joseph said that all of them were going to do obeisance to him. They're going to bow down. Well, here it is. Joseph's dream has come true. You want to talk about temptation? 20 years ago, this would have been when Joseph started rubbing his brother's face in the sand. He said, you didn't like me now. You sold me. Look what's going to happen to you. You think you're going to get grain? I'm not giving y'all anything. He could have had them thrown into prison. But Joseph was no longer tempted to seek revenge. He's seeing God's plan working through him. He understands what the dream that he had as a teenager meant. And so he told him he'd sell him some grain, but that they needed to leave Simeon there. He accused them of being spies. He didn't punish him, but he was going to mess with them a little bit. They said they had a younger brother. He said, well, prove you're not lying. You leave Simeon here until you bring the younger brother back. Now, apparently for the first time, his brothers feel guilty about the way they've treated Joseph. Verse 21 says, And they said one to another, We are very guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon him. And don't you just love what big brother Reuben says in verse 22? And Reuben answered them, saying, Spake I not unto you, saying, Do not sin against the child, and ye would not hear. Therefore, behold, also his blood is required. Big brothers are like that sometimes. Didn't I tell you? I told you so. You wouldn't listen to me. I tried to tell you this was going to happen. Anyway, Simeon stays behind. The other brothers take the grain. They start out for home. They stop. And then they discover that their money's back in their sacks. And now they're scared because Joseph's already accused them of being spies. Now he's going to think they're thieves too because their money's back in their sack. So they're scared. They go home. They tell their dad, said, they sold us the grain. Our money's back in our sacks. We can't go back because they're going to think we're thieves. Besides that, they said don't come back without Benjamin. And Jacob wasn't going to let Benjamin go. So they stay until they run out of food again. And then there's a lengthy debate. And eventually Jacob relents and he agrees to send Benjamin. He prepares gifts to send to the governor. He sends double the money. They go back to Egypt. And this time when Joseph sees them, he tells them, bring them all to my house. And this messed with their minds a little bit because they assumed the worst. So as soon as they got to his house, they started explaining, look, we didn't steal the money. We found it in our sacks. And they're talking to the steward. And he tells them it's going to be okay. He said, you don't have to fear. We got your money. Everything's all right. In the meantime, Joseph shows up for dinner. And he had all the brothers sitting at one table. He had the Egyptians sitting at another table because they weren't allowed to eat together. And then he's sitting at another table facing his brother. And Joseph wasn't above messing with them just a little bit more. Look at verse 33. It says, and they set before him the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men marveled one at another. Joseph had them seated. Apparently there was a seating chart, and he had them lined up in order of their birth. And they're thinking, how does he know who's the oldest and who's the youngest? How can he do that? And they marveled at that. Chapter 44 starts off the same way. Joseph orders all the money to be put back in their sacks again when they send them home. This time he tells them to put his silver cup into Benjamin's sack. The brothers head back home. They're likely confused, but they must have been in pretty good spirits. But that didn't last for long. This time they stopped. Joseph sent somebody after them. The servants came and said, somebody has stolen my master's cup. One of y'all is a thief. They said, no, they were sure they were innocent. They said, no. In fact, they were so sure, they said, if you can find that cup on one of us, he'll be your slave. He'll go back and serve Joseph as a slave. And so they opened the grain sack, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. And now they're going back to Joseph. And he told them they could take their grain and go back home, but Benjamin had to stay. And Judah demonstrated that Joseph wasn't the only one that had grown up over this last 22 years. He told them they couldn't really go back to his father because it would kill Jacob if they didn't bring Benjamin back. He's already lost one child. It would kill him if he lost this one. Earlier, they hadn't been too concerned about what Jacob would feel when he lost Joseph, but now they saw what that did to him. They don't want it to happen again. Verse 31, he said, it shall come to pass when he seeth that the lad is not with us, that he will die. And thy servant shall bring down the gray hairs of thy servant our father with sorrow to the grave. Now Joseph's not tempted to mess with his brothers anymore. Seeing this change in them brings a change in his heart. So he sends all the Egyptians away. He reveals himself to his brothers. Genesis 45 verse 3. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph, doth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. You want to talk about an understatement. Troubled at his presence. They were probably scared to death because they knew what they deserved. They knew what they'd done. They knew that he had the power now to do anything he wanted to them. How did Joseph react? Verse 4, and Joseph said to his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. And he said, I'm your brother Joseph. I am Joseph your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. Joseph saw God in this plan. Joseph's been in prison. Joseph's been a slave. But Joseph saw that God was working through him. And we know how the story ends. Joseph finds out about, Pharaoh finds out about Joseph's family. He sends carts, bring them back. Bring all of them, let them live in the land of Egypt. They provide the whole land of Goshen for them to dwell. God provides for his people through Joseph and through Pharaoh. God's providence is evident throughout this story. All that was required was for Joseph to stop thinking about Joseph and start thinking about God. For Joseph to resist temptation, for Joseph to serve God. And the same thing is true in our lives. But in order to live for God, you need to be a Christian. The only life worth living, the only death one would dare to die. Maybe you're already a Christian, but you're not doing so well dealing with temptation. Or the things in your life that you need to get away from, or the things in your life that you need to run, or the things in your life that are keeping you from being what God wants you to be. It's time for us to stop making excuses, put God back into control. You're subject to the Lord's invitation tonight. Won't you come right now? We stand together as we sing.